Welcome to the Employment, Law, and HR Podcast with your host, Alison Colley.
Hello and welcome to this episode 231 of the Employment Law and HR Podcast. I'm your host, Alison Colley. I'm an employment solicitor and I run the firm Real Employment Law Advice, where together with my colleagues we provide advice and assistance to both employers and employees on all aspects of employment law and HR. In today's episode of the podcast, I'm bringing you another interview. Today I'm interviewing Alice Derbyshire and we're talking about all things supporting your employees on maternity leave or new parents. Alice believes that businesses are better off having mums in their team because of the diversity, increased creativity, innovation and employee retention. So she's brought together her skills over 20 years in the corporate HR as a business leader and as a qualified coach and certified NLP practitioner, as well as being a mother on her own journey as well. She's brought together all of those skills to support businesses and leaders in creating a supportive environment for their employees. And she supports new parents in their transition back into work. So without further ado, I'm going to get into this week's featured content. Okay, so I'm really pleased to be joined by Alice Derbyshire today. Hi, Alice.
Hello, Alison.
And Alice, do you want to give us a little introduction about yourself and what it is you do?
So my background is in HR, worked in generalist role for about 20 odd years. And despite all the kind of dismissal and redundancy and other conversations, perhaps I found the most difficult conversations were the ones supporting parents through their transition from pregnancy and then through to the return to work. And one of the things that I noticed was that we were really losing far too many women after they became parents. And it felt like a real travesty and a loss of amazing talent. And I felt like it didn't need to be that way. Simultaneously, towards the end of my time being employed, I did my coach training and kind of, I suppose, brought all the things together of my training in HR, my training as a coach, and then subsequently becoming a mum to really think about how we could do things a bit differently, because these conversations, especially on the return to work, were always sort of fraught with emotion and challenge and things, and I just wanted it to be different. And so I set my business up really to explore that and to see how we could be doing it a bit differently.
And of course, we've talked about mums and mums returning to work and the pregnancy journey and all of that sort of thing. But now, of course, with shared parental leave, it could be either sex who has a long period of leave. And I assume that the same position applies and the same kind of considerations to a male employee who's taking a long period of parental leave, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key thing for me is that it's the time that people take. It seems that the longer people take, often the harder the transition back is. And so, yeah, absolutely. It could be either. I think anything kind of beyond 6-ish to 9 months, that's when things become a little bit more challenging for either.
And so what are the kind of mistakes that you see employers making regularly in relation to parents who take a period of parental or maternity leave?
Oh, that's a great question, mistake. So I'm not sure if it's a mistake per se. I think that one of the things that I see happening a lot is almost a not taking time and giving attention to the fact that this is a major life transition that an individual is going through. So becoming a parent is something is significant. It's major in somebody's life. And frankly, it changes their identity, it changes relationships, it changes everything. And I think that we often as employers don't take due time and consideration to acknowledge what's actually going on for the individual at a human level, often because we're wrapped up in stuff that's going on in the workplace. So there's a big piece for me really about how can we just stop and acknowledge that. And I often feel that if we only did that, then actually the rest would be a lot easier. I think the other thing is that there's quite a lot going on at this time for the woman, but also for the business. They've got to think about how they're going to cover that role or not, what that means for the team. It's a time of change. And I think that we just don't necessarily give it the due time and consideration and thought and planning, probably, to really make it something smooth. The other thing that I'm thinking about is just a general lack of communication, and this works for both sides. So both for employee and employer, manager, leader, I just don't think we talk often enough, and we don't have the open, honest conversations about what we both need, what both sides need. We as individuals have got various needs when we become parents or on that journey to parenthood. That's not always straightforward either. And equally, the businesses have got needs too. And I really feel like there's a communication piece that is often missing, and rather we make assumptions about things, people, goings on, which if only we were to come together and actually have a proper, open, honest conversation, a lot of those things, mistakes or difficulties wouldn't kind of show up in quite the same way, I would say.
And we're going to talk in a minute about some of the things that employers can do, sort of the positives. But one of the pushbacks, especially for smaller employers, will be, well, we're already really busy, going to lose a member of the team. We can't really afford the additional time, that you're suggesting that we need to put into this. What are the benefits, and what are the benefits you've seen for employers who do take time to think purposely about how they manage employees who are taking a period of leave for parental reasons?
So I think the phrase that comes to mind is go slow to go fast. I think we're in a world of go, 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 go. And actually, I think that's when things do get overlooked. There's some real value in just taking the time to understand what's going on for somebody so that you can together work out what support they need to enable them to perform at their very, very best, which ultimately is what we need as businesses. We need people to be showing up and performing at their best. And of course, that may change to some degree depending on what's going on. I think the support, the work that I've done with lots of women, the support that I've seen happen is that people feel more confident. They feel more able to show up in the way that they want to show up. They feel able to do the work that they need to do without feeling judged and so on and so forth. The other real benefit is that you actually get to retain these really smart, brilliant people that actually you've potentially spent some years investing in already. And it's this sort of short-term part of the maternity transition, but for long-term gain. In that, when we do support people, these smart, brilliant people can stay on in the organisation. We can continue to enjoy the benefit of them. But also it costs a lot to replace people, frankly. By the time you've added in time to advertise, collect the CVs, do the interviews and all of that sort of stuff, and then any sort of lost productivity while somebody gets on board, or lost relationships if you're in a client situation, lost relationships that might have if somebody leaves. So there's a big cost around recruitment and retention. So I think one of the big benefits is keeping the staff at a business level. But I think on a personal human level, there's something about health and well-being and enabling somebody to be their best self at work.
And ultimately, as an employer or manager, that's your job, isn't it? I always advocate for that. Your job is to make things as easy as possible for your staff to do the best that they can. And obviously, this is one way of doing that. So, yes, obviously, it is time consuming, but there are loads of benefits to taking that time to do it. Okay, then. So let's move on to some of your tips for employers then on how they can manage this process. Let's take particularly in relation to women who are pregnant, who are going on maternity leave, and then obviously the transition back to work. So what are the kind of things that you recommend to employers that they do or take time to do?
I think I want to start with a couple of kind of philosophy points, if you like. I think it's really helpful to notice your own mindset around this. So we all have our own parenting story. Each and every one of us, whether we are a parent or not, at some point we have been born into this world, and so we have our own parents. But I think when we stop to think about what our own parenting journey is, we can notice our mindset around certain things, and it's our mindset that then affects how we behave, what our attitude is towards something, and this can have a real ripple effect in all types of management, but particularly around parenting. So the first thing that I always encourage is for people just to stop and acknowledge what their parenting journey is and what that might mean for how they may manage somebody in any given circumstance. That feels really, really important to me. Similarly, but perhaps differently, is to acknowledge that everybody who goes through this journey, and every time they go through the journey, it's going to be different. So each and every one of us has perhaps different career ambitions. We've got different financial circumstances, different support networks at home. We might have different needs of our children and so on and so forth. So we have to be really, really careful not to make any assumptions about if a mum comes to us or somebody comes to us and says that I'm pregnant. We've got to be really mindful not to sort of generalise about what that equals, and instead have a conversation with them to understand, well, what does that mean for you and how can we best support you and so on and so forth. So I think there's a real thing throughout this around treat everybody as an individual because they are. And even if somebody has sort of a second pregnancy or a third pregnancy while they're under your employment, then that experience is likely to be different again. You can't assume that the way it's been the first time will be the same the second or the third time. So I think that feels really important just from philosophical points, for want of a better way of putting it. And then in terms of practical things, the really big thing for me is to communicate. Communicate. You cannot do this enough. It feels just so important. I think if ever there is a question in your mind, rather than making any assumptions or anything like that, just ask. And that again goes for both actually the employer and the employee. And I think there are some key moments to communicate throughout the journey. And I don't know, I could perhaps go through a couple of things. Would that be helpful if we talk?
Yeah, absolutely. So the practical ways, so people can take it away from what we're talking about today and actually start using it would be great.
So one thing that I always recommend is before somebody goes on maternity leave is actually to do a performance review with them so that you are all clear about where they're at the point at which they go on maternity leave. Lots of organisations have performance review cycles. Some don't have cycles at all. They just happen whenever they happen. But I think it's always really helpful to have some sort of a performance conversation which is documented before you go on mat leave so that, as I say, when the return comes, not only does the individual have a reference point, but also so does the employer. So everyone's clear about where's what. And in that conversation, just discussing career ambitions at that point. Now, these will inevitably change. They always do, but I think it can be quite helpful. There's some people who have got clear eyes on a particular promotion, for example, and that promotion opportunity may come up during maternity leave. And I think it's really helpful for us to know that ahead of the maternity leave so that if an opportunity were to come up, then we can get in touch during the maternity leave or whatever. So that's the first thing, have a performance review. Also before mat leave, I think it's really helpful just to agree how you want to stay in touch during the leave. This will be different for different people. Some people want to be quite actively involved during their time off. Others might actually want to take the opportunity to be away. Caveat always that we never quite know what that period is going to look like because we don't know what happens on arrival of the child, whether they're going to be a sleeper, whether there's any challenges, we just don't know. So I think everyone being very clear that can change and that's okay for it to change, but let's agree how we kind of manage all of that. Third practical thing is put in your diary some key dates. So you might want to put 3 months after they've gone on leave, just to send a message and check in. How are you? Is everything okay? Another one around 6 months. Hey, you're about halfway through. I'm assuming here at this point we've got a 12-month leave period. How are things going? feel free, if you want to start thinking about talking to us about return to work, then do so on and so forth. So I think just some calendar points, even if it's not necessarily to get in touch, but just to remind yourself how far along that leave period you are. And as you're getting closer to the return to work, being mindful to schedule time to actually get prepared for that return. In terms of, we can perhaps, it feels like flexible working might be a whole other conversation. So I'm going to go to another practical thing around the return to work. I believe quite strongly that the reintroduction into the business is a co-creation. I think that we do have a responsibility as employers to help shape that. So we know what's gone on in the business while the individual's been away. And I think we have a responsibility to set up the meetings or any training or anything like that, making sure that the passwords and passcodes and whatever you need to actually do your work is all set up and prepared well ahead of somebody returning. But also having a conversation with the individual about what they think they might need. And I always, when I'm working with mums, is to talk to them about, okay, well, what do you need? What can you take control of? Because I do think that it's a two-way thing. Really important to have on a checklist somewhere. Maybe that's another tip. A checklist of all the things that are important that you need to get done to make sure that when that individual returns, you have done everything, like get the computer set up, get key meetings in the diary or whatever it might be. Another, on the day of their return, really practical, really simple, send an email to the entire organisation or whoever the appropriate client groups are to welcome that individual back. This goes a million miles to make the individual feel sort of really welcomed back and supported as they return. And it's a tiny thing, but means a lot to lots of people. Also, as part of that sort of return transition point, ask the question around whether or not the mother is still breastfeeding. I know that this can feel a bit tricky for some individuals. However, it's really, really important. And it's important that you have got a space where a woman is able to go and do the breastfeeding that they need to do, i.e. the pumping if they're at work, or the space if you are working in a hybrid way and you're working at home, just allowing the time and space at home to be able to go off and do that. And I think what works really well is when sort of the timings of any sort of feeding are put in the diary so that everybody's clear about when that is, and it's sacred time. And that will vary for individual depending on what point they return to work. Then I would say once they're back, it's really helpful to agree with them about a sort of a schedule of support and one-to-one meetings where you are sharing what's gone on in the organisation, sharing any team news, but then also really exploring and revisiting what's their role, what does that look like, what does the first month, 3 months, 6 months look like, and making sure that you've got regular check-in points, even if it's just 5 minutes. And these check-ins are really, they are about work, but they're also about the individual's well-being and how they are getting on. This is a massive transition back to work, and I think that it goes really far just to say, you know, how are you? What else do you need? How else can we support you? Those sorts of things. So I think you'll see the theme along all of this is around communication. Let's keep talking, because even if a business isn't able to accommodate something for somebody, at least having that conversation is helpful. And at least we as individuals then feel heard and understood. They're the things that come to my mind right now.
And I really like the idea of having a checklist, because obviously if you probably do this more than once over the course of time, so having that all written down makes it much easier to make sure you're doing all of those things. And of course, it was really helpful that you mentioned there about asking about breastfeeding, because of course you have an obligation in relation to health and safety, and you might have to do an additional risk assessment for somebody returning who is breastfeeding. So all really important considerations. And I really like the point that you made about it being a two-way thing, because quite often employees can kind of sit back and think, right, well, they haven't spoken to me, put the onus entirely on the employer, when really they're itching to ask questions or to communicate. So what are the kind of things that individuals can do to help facilitate that smooth transition?
So whenever I think about this, I always kind of find myself reflecting on the fact that one of the things that lots of people come to me about after they've had the baby is they tell me about a story where they've found it really challenging that they've always had real control of their life. They know what's what, they know what they're doing when, and so on and so forth, and that's been really joyful. And then when baby comes, that all just goes out of the window, because there's a little human being who's got their own will and mind, and they're going to do what they want when they want. And that can be a real challenge for people. And so for me, there's something about the transition back to work, which is an opportunity for you to take back some control, actually, and to take back some ownership of what you need and what you want. And I think that it can be really helpful for individuals to take proper time to think about what is it that I need now? What is it that I want now? Because we have gone through a bit of an identity shift as we become parents. And I think it can be really helpful to, just stop and say, okay, well, let me reconnect to myself and what I need and what I want, and what do I practically need as well, in terms of need to leave the office at 5 o'clock because the nursery closes at 5:30, for example. I think that would be my first step, is to really get clear about what you need and want, and then have a think about what that means for your job and your job role, and then have that conversation with the business. And that goes to what your working pattern might be, but it also might be I was talking earlier about the co-creating your reinduction, if you like. What is it that you would find helpful, actually, because that's going to be individual, and again, sharing that with employers. And I think for me, it just comes back to this talking, a kind of a non-work related thing, except it is work related, is that I really think that it's helpful for women to have conversations at home and with their support network about what goes on at home once they return to work. What I see almost always is that when women are on maternity leave, we end up taking on lots more of their household chores. So the washing, the shopping, the cleaning, making dinner, so on and so forth. The challenge then, though, is that when they go back to work, they haven't actually got the same amount of time to do all of that stuff. And so I think there is a moment where you need to really stop and think about what that's all going to look like and who's going to do what. And also agree when you're returning, what happens when your little one is sick, because inevitably they will be, and they will be a lot in that first year, because they're going into new environments and they pick up bugs and so on and so forth. So just as you're trying to get back to work and be go, 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 your little one is probably going to be poorly. It can cause a friction for you, and it's pretty uncomfortable. But I think what can really help is you've had that conversation with, if there's a partner in the picture, with your partner, if there's not a partner in the picture, whoever else your support network is, to agree, okay, what happens when I get that call from nursery? Or indeed, is it me that's going to get that call from nursery or the daycare, or is it going to be somebody else who gets that call? And then what do we do about it? Not only, so having all of those sorts of conversations, so you're a bit organised at home and sharing out the responsibilities that may have all become yours. And this would go if it was the dad who was doing the main care rather than, mum or whatever. And so I think there's doing that, but then also making sure that, especially around that child sickness piece, having that conversation with your manager when you go back to work. Just want to let you know that we all know that kids get sick, and it's the worst possible timing for me as I'm trying to get back to work. This is kind of what we've agreed at home. Is there anything else that you need or want from me in this situation? Again, sort of almost preempting it, because that does is it just takes the stress off when it happens. So you're not constantly thinking, what am I going to do if? You're like, well, I know what I'm going to do if. This is what's going to happen, and then everyone's going to be cool about it. And by having that conversation, it gives everybody the opportunity to say, well, actually, that isn't going to work for me, but this could. Okay, cool, we'll do that then instead. So there's that piece as well, I think.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice, because it does stop that misunderstanding, people jump into conclusions, all of that sort of thing. Yeah. And also, how can you expect your employer to best support you if you're not being open and honest with them? Yeah. So you do need to be upfront and honest with them, and particularly if there are areas that you're struggling with or you're going to find difficult, because then your employer can support you. All too often I see employees make assumptions about how their employer is going to behave or react. And because of that, it then impacts on the relationship negatively. You know, it's that whole adage, if you go into it expecting something, you're probably going to end up getting that outcome, aren't you? Versus having an open mind and approaching it that way. So I do think that's some really, really good advice there. And I'm sure that people have thought about some of these things unconsciously, but now, you know, I think a conscious effort in relation to that is very important. And so you obviously help women who are returning to work as part of your coaching. And I understand that's often something that's paid for and sort of arranged by the employer. So what are the kind of things that you do in your coaching to help women who are transitioning back to work?
Perhaps the easiest way to explain is I've got an online program that people go through. And so perhaps I can share some of the things that we explore there that people seem to find helpful. The first thing is really kind of reconnecting to yourself. So this is around looking at what matters. I talked a bit about this earlier, looking at really what matters to you, but at a sort of personal level, and what is going to give you meaning at work. So, you know, the thing is that when we go back to work, we are making a decision to give our child to another person, and that could be a family member, but it could be somebody else. But we're making a decision to not be with them. And what I find with most women is that means that actually that work's it's got to mean something. It's got to be worth it. It's got to be worthwhile. Otherwise, other emotions can come to play. So I think really getting focused on what is that going to look like for you, and how could you possibly achieve that at work. The other thing that we often look at when we're kind of reconnecting with ourselves is, what are your strengths and skills? We often forget these, but we've also picked up a heap of skills when we've gone on maternity leave. So many people say to me, I'm much better at negotiation, because toddlers are master negotiators. I'm much better at persuasion. I'm much more kind of productive, effective with my time, because I don't have time to kind of not be, I suppose, is probably the best way of putting it. So really getting people to think about their strengths and skills. And one of the exercises I very often invite women to do is to reach out or send a message to colleagues, perhaps their manager, but also friends, and just ask them what they see as their values. So I might write to you and say, hi, Alison, I'm about to return to work and I'm just reconnecting with myself, and I'm just wondering, what do you see as my strengths and skills, and how do I add value to your life or to work or to the team or whatever it might be? And every single time without fail, people get their responses back and they are pleasantly surprised. It brings some heartwarming confidence to them, because they're like, oh, so I'm quite good at all of this stuff. But also what happens is that you get themes. There's always themes about what people's strengths are. So it's not necessarily everybody thinks something different of me, but there's always some sort of consolidation about somebody's strengths. And it's a really powerful exercise for people to see themselves in a different light. Rather than, we've just spent months in chaos, frankly, haven't we? Whatever point we get with the kids. And this is a real opportunity to just acknowledge and recognise what you're bringing to the party, I suppose. So that's a real big thing. And I think with those things together really help people to build the belief in themselves again, and to see and acknowledge what they can offer, which brings some level of confidence, I suppose. Confidence is a big word that can mean all sorts of things, but that is the word that often comes up. People say, oh, it's just giving me confidence to ask for what I need. Also in the coaching, we are exploring a lot about, okay, what do I need to make this work? There's suddenly a lot going on. Life was busy enough before a dependent came along, and now we've got this other dependent, and we've got specific timelines that we have to keep as well. So there's often an exploration around, how am I going to manage all of this without totally losing myself? And that leads me to probably the final point, is how do I get time for myself? Because what we know is that unless we keep our cup full, it's very difficult for us to give to others. And I see this time and time and again. I don't have time to do my exercise class. I don't have time to do this. I don't have time to do that. And I really want to invite all parents, frankly, to create that time, because the time is there. We've just got to get creative and imaginative, and also ask for the space to give ourselves whatever it is we need. So yeah, they're the sort of topics, and also the conversation about how we're going to manage all of this at home with another partner or whoever it may be. So they're probably the top line thoughts, and anything else that might crop up.
Well, that's really helpful. I think you've given some really good and useful information for both employers and employees on how to manage that transition. Before we round off, is there any other final pieces of wisdom or anything that you haven't spoken about that you'd like to share?
Probably the only thing that comes to mind is truly nothing is fixed and everything will always change. And I think this is particularly the case in the first 5 years. First 5 years of childhood, that early childhood years, everything is changing all of the time. No sooner have you thought you've got something sorted, it changes again. And I think that change continues at a different pace and in a different way as the children get older. But I think for both employers and employees, it's really useful to think about the fact that it is always changing. And what I need today when my child is born is going to be different to what I might need when they're 5 or when they're 15. And I think if we can keep some semblance of openness and fluidity and flexibility, then that can serve everybody really, really well.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. And if anybody wants to get in touch with you, I will, of course, put your details in the show notes. But what's the best way of contacting you?
I would probably say via email. That's probably the easiest way.
And we'll put the details in there. So if anyone's interested in learning more about how you can support your employees in the transition, then you can contact Alice directly.
Yeah.
So thanks very much for your time. It's been lovely to talk to you again today. And everything you've shared has been very helpful. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Alison.
I'm sure you will agree that was a fantastic episode with lots of really good hints and tips for employers to use. If you need any help or support in relation to the things we've talked about today, then you can reach out to Alice directly, and I will include all the details in the show notes so that you can contact her. And of course, if you have any questions about legislation or employment rights in relation to maternity or pregnancy, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with myself or one of the team. We'd be happy to have a chat with you and help you to get things in place to ensure that you are the best employer you can be. I hope that you have a fantastic 2 weeks, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Thanks again for listening. Just want to finalise by saying I wouldn't be a lawyer unless I had a legal disclaimer. So I must just say to you that the information in this podcast is for information only. It's general review and a general update. It's always necessary to get specific legal advice about your circumstances. So please don't rely on anything that you've heard in this podcast. But please do feel free to contact me if you'd like further information or specific advice.